Welcome to the Rethink and Return podcast with Jason Shepperd, and we are so excited for today's conversation as we talk about a church of house churches. Jason, I'm so excited to dig into this. Where did this concept of a church of house churches really formulate in your mind?
Yeah. Hey, Nils, thanks for helping me have this conversation again. As always, you're helpful in guiding the process of talking this out. Yeah, this began a long time ago for me. I mean, it began before it began, right? It began in the pickup truck in a parking lot in college when I knew God was calling me to leave my previously decided upon direction and head towards the church world. And I prayed a prayer, help me become part of the church that you originally intended for it to be. That's what I want to lead. And so that began for me a long journey of really discovering what the church was intended to be. And then I started working in churches, and there was a lot of good and a lot of not good, and just a lot of neutral nothing. And then I'd read the, Bible, and I'd travel the world, and I'd read church history, and I'm like, I think we're missing something.
Yeah.
And so, but I couldn't put my finger on it. And really, I excused a lot of the neutrality or even the negativity for the excuse of some of the good that was happening.
Yeah.
But at some point, I couldn't do that anymore. So I had to synthesize all I had learned in the Bible, all I had seen in my global travels around with the church in almost 40 countries, and all of my church history studies, and just started what I called a church of house churches. I saw people rebelling against the traditional prevailing model church, and they would leave it, and they would start a house church or a micro church. And I knew what they were pursuing, but I felt like that wasn't the answer, because those places often became independent, individualized, isolated, and impotent. And then they'd get more easily injured because there's nobody to help you. And so I think leaving the prevailing model church, the traditional model church, and completely swing the pendulum to an isolated house church or micro church, I didn't feel like that was healthy. Also, I didn't see it in Scripture. My studies in church history helped me see that, the second generation of the church would do more of what they were doing, not necessarily different from what they were doing. So Paul would go plant the gospel somewhere. They'd become a house church, as we read about in the Bible, to the church that meets in so-and-so's house. But then they would have another house church, another house church. And so they wouldn't completely change their structure. They would just continue to multiply their structure. And so they kept the beauty of these Sunday gatherings, but then they multiplied house churches where all the pastoring and benevolence and care and all that in community and discipleship where it took place. And so I knew what I was doing wasn't what we were supposed to be doing, the traditional prevailing model, super centralized, what I call program, platform, and personality-driven church. That is highly dependent upon the sacred space and certain kinds of people to lead it. So I knew we couldn't keep doing that, but I also knew that the pendulum swing wasn't the answer either. So for me, it was a church of many house churches. So we're a church of house churches. I can easily articulate that theologically. I can define my doctrine with that. I can't with either the isolated house church that's disconnected from other house churches and has no authority over it, or the super centralized church. I cannot argue either one of those from Scripture, but I can argue at church of house churches.
And so maybe talk about it. I think some people would perceive you're either a church or you're a house church. And I say a church of you're larger maybe than a small gathering of churches. So how did that go from being either or to both and as you begin to formulate this comprehension biblically of how to model the church?
Yeah, well, I mean, a house church is a small church, but it can be an end in and of itself, because the gospel can't saturate a city with that. You can't multiply believers with a house church. You can multiply believers with a church of house churches. What we call a church of house churches, we call it that because it is one church. It has common eldership overseeing all of it. Like you would see, a church start in Galatia when one house church, because there were just a few believers. And then Paul would He'd go into a town, he'd spend all night discipling people. He'd leave the next day, he'd raise up 2 people. Maybe he felt like, hey, the Spirit of God has led me to feel like you're the ones, or he just sensed a connection with them, or an agreement, or an alignment, or understanding, or their leadership gifts, how they interact in the group, whatever. Paul would raise up 2 elders, and he would leave town. And these elders would then oversee this house church, but when the house church multiplied, they would still oversee all the house churches. And those house churches would then come together and meet, often on a weekly basis, sometimes on a monthly basis, whenever they could, depending upon how far apart they were. But they were one church, overseen by one elder, moving together, because Paul told Titus, you're still accountable for all these house churches in these cities. You're accountable to teach them sound doctrine. And so the elders had authority over all of the house churches. And so they were a connection, a collective, if you will, of house churches. So we call it a church of house churches.
I love it. And I'm curious, Jason, you mentioned that a lot of this formulation came in your travels. Is there maybe a specific region in the world? Because so often in the world I grew up in, I saw the North American church, and I remember when I was new in ministry, we went to Willow, we went to Saddleback, we looked at kind of other North American churches as models. I never looked outside of North America for models of how to do church effectively. Was there a region that maybe got your attention, or a couple of different things that helped you piece this together?
Yeah, I mean, it's really, the church is multiplying rapidly around the world. And in those places where it's multiplying rapidly, you see a lot of the DNA elements that we talk about in this ecclesiology, a church of house churches. You see things decentralized from primary place and priest. You go to Africa. I sat under a baobab tree in Africa where they were gathering for church. They were coming from different villages, but to have a common worship and teaching time, then they dispersed back to their villages. Some of them walked hours from their place, but to be with all the other believers together under that authority and go back. You'll see this happening in a lot of places in Asia and Latin America. If you go into some remote places in Latin America, you'll find this happening. I mean, they don't have, this primary sacred place, these buildings, and they don't have primary sacred leaders. I mean, they decentralized from primary place and priest, which is one of the elements of the church. And they distribute pastoral leadership. They're not looking for sacred clergy to do it. They believe in the priesthood of the believers. So that's happening. I mean, go to a mountain in Colombia where indigenous people are having church. They're carrying some of these DNA elements there. And so I've seen it in Latin America. I've seen it in Africa. I've seen it a little bit in Asia. I've seen it in Turkey. So I have seen it around the world. And some of it in super crude form, some of it's still developing as it was in the early church. But they're espousing a lot of these elements around the world where there are movements of the gospel happening.
And then, leading into church history, where do you think that we began to veer off of this path? Maybe most specifically in the church in North America when it comes to that house church model.
Well, I mean, almost any even elementary church historian would say that the 4th century is where things shifted. People, differ in their ideas of how much shifted, what shifted, but really at Constantinople, that's where things started to take a turn. And we went back to sacred place and sacred priest in the 4th century. The reason the gospel spread so rapidly the first 3 centuries, I mean, we had boldness of believers, yes, but we have the same Holy Spirit today. The same Spirit of God that led those believers to have their boldness is the same Spirit that lives in us. So I don't think it's because we have a different spirit. I do believe we have a different structure of the church, and we put this really hard to replicate and multiply container around the church, and that happened in the 4th century. I mean, Jesus said, wherever a few people gather, I'm going to be with you. I mean, he demolished the temple, synagogue, ideology. It doesn't have to be in a sacred place. And then Paul said the priest of the believer. That would have blown people's minds in the 1st century because, Paul came out of the Sanhedrin, and so he came out of the sacred priest idea of these are the people who can perform these duties. And now Paul told the common man, you're part of the priesthood of the believer. And so, these are radical ideas. And so they adopted them, they embraced them. And the gospel spread rapidly. Churches were planted around the world. Disciples were being made and reproduced. But then 4th century, what happened was, hey, we're going to now build buildings for you again. That's where sacred things happen. space isn't bad, but sacred space is not a part of a New Testament theology. We're all in space somewhere because we're the fall, just like we wear clothes. We need to meet somewhere together. So either we believe we shouldn't meet together or meeting somewhere is fine, but sacred space, I mean, that's where we took a shift in sacred priests. These are the people who can perform these duties. And so you start to see all the way back to the 4th century. I'll teach you the Bible. You don't need to do it. I'll perform baptisms. You don't need to do it. We'll do weddings and funerals. You don't need to do it. We'll give you communion. You can't do it yourself, right? And so that's continued on. And it's really Old Testament covenant theology readopted in a New Testament form. And every church since the 4th century has been adopting it. And so even when they came over from North America, they wanted to let go of a government-controlled church, but they still had the same form: sacred space, sacred place, sacred priest.
Yeah. And do you think that it has to do with control, or just that decentralization is just not natural for people to let go of that level of control with the priesthood of the believer? What do you think? What is that maybe human nature that led to that distance from that original model?
Man, I think that question is really insightful. Like I think if we press into that, we get some deep answers there. And so, it's speculative, of course, until you start to really exercise it, and then you realize what it is you're letting go of. And so I do think part of it has to do with purpose. Like when somebody like me feels like I'm called to give my life to the local church, we have a runway now that's been perpetuated for centuries, for millennia, and that it's really easy for us to know, well, this is the way to do it. You go to seminary or go work in a church and you become identified as clergy, and now you're the one to do it. I mean, we're just one step away. We just got to get hired at a church, and that's the pathway. And so the other pathway, I feel called to give my life to the local church, but I'm not going to do that pathway. It's really unclear what I do. It hasn't been modeled for us for a very long time. And so I think it's unclear. The pathway is easy and clear the other way. It's unclear in this other way. Another reason, I think, is because this way is messy. It's not as clean. And I think we could get into control here, but not so much as a power authoritarian control, but I feel like I need to control the way that church happens. And so this is exactly how it's been happening. We have programs, we have classes, we have, all these things. So let's just keep doing it that way. And then we can, improve it a little bit here and there. So I think there is I need to control the church. Yeah. So it's a pathway, it's control, but there is a little bit of purpose. Like, hey, if I'm called, and I feel like I am, and I'm called to be a pastor leading over a church. There are people called to do that, to give their entire life dedicated to serve the church. I'm so glad there are. But if there's not something special for me to do, then I've lost my way. I've lost my purpose. And so I think rethinking all of this is a really scary thing for people. And so that's why we call this podcast Rethink and Return, right? Everybody's rethinking it.
Yes.
Some people stop at the point of sacrifice.
Yep.
Right.
And Jason, I'm going to put a tab in this right now, because I think we're going to have a future episode on rethinking and returning to calling, because I think your insights into calling are so there's a lot of depth there, and I think there's a wrestle with what we have even perceived, that and how we've maybe even abused that term to a certain extent, and I think that's a big part of this as we even look at the ecclesiology and how we approach this. I think there's probably a lot of pastor leaders that are listening to this, though, and probably just saying, well, we're a church of house churches. We just call them small groups. How would you differentiate how we have approached small groups in the last, maybe couple of decades in the church? And how does that differentiate from house churches?
Yeah, I mean, we hear that all the time. In fact, one question that I thought was really insightful was, isn't this just a robust small group model?
Yes. And
so my response was, well, this is smaller, and it is a group, meaning a connection of people, but it breaks down in similarities after that. I like to say we're taking a small group or a class, we're making it a church. and we're taking a small group leader or teacher and we're making them a pastor. And so all of the functions of church happen in a house church. Benevolence happens in a house church. We have no other way for it to happen in our church. I mean, we read Acts 2, and any pastor, anybody who's given their life to the church, any believer who loves the church, our heart burns when we said they sold their goods and possessions and gave to anybody as they had need. Where does that happen in most churches? Through some centralized office, a very, a form. It just feels benign. It's not personal. People don't. I mean, for us, benevolence is a function of the church. It happens in house church. Discipleship is a primary function of the church. That happens through house church. One-on-one discipleship. Baptism happens through house church. Benevolence happens through house church. Discipleship, discipline, and correction happens in house church. And so we have taken the lid off what a small group does. And so most people, when they say it's the same thing, you just ask them a few questions. Does your small group do this? No. Does your small group do this? No. Does your small group pastor do this? No. Our leader do this? No, no. And when we keep asking them that all the no's, that's the gap between a small group and a house church. So it's small and it's a group, but we put the lid on small groups and we said, you stop here. We'll take care of the rest for you. The clergy will take care of the rest for you. And so we're taking the lid off a small group and we're fully empowering it as a church and identifying it as that. The same with the small group leader. We're making them a pastor.
Yeah. And that, as people begin to hear that, I think you just check those boxes of like, oh yeah, we're not doing that. We're not. And I think it's overwhelming of like, wait, you do benevolence in your small groups, if you're going to call them small groups. And it's like, no, this is why it's a house church. And not a small group. And we're going to dig into these details of how you have seen it, because this isn't theoretical. This is something that you are living out and is functioning in a beautiful way. I think probably, though, one of the biggest questions that people have of like, wow, that's crazy empowerment that you're giving to what I've always called small group leaders, that it's always like, okay, if you'll show up every week, we'll make you a leader. Our expectations have been low. How do you, I think practically, what is the oversight and what is the accountability for those house church pastors as you build out this structure with those expectations?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of training that goes into it. Selection is very important. I mean, when Paul told Titus, appoint elders in every town, a pastor available for all the people, he then goes into a list of qualifications. And that means he had to know them. They had to prove it to them. He even told Timothy, don't let a new believer become this conceited. So like when he listed the qualifications for a leader, a pastor, an elder in Timothy and in Titus, it implied for us a lot of things. One, you got to know them. This is going to take a little bit of time. How do you know them? Even he told Titus chapter 2, verse 1, teach what's in accord with sound doctrine. So we go through a process of knowing, I call them the qualifications and the qualities of a leader, because some people have the qualifications of a leader, but not a quality of a pastor. I mean, all the qualities that a pastor needs are not listed in the qualifications. And so, somebody gentle and caring, these kind of things. And so, and compassionate, we have a lot of qualities that we look for. So our first two house church pastors were the most important. Yeah. And I had to choose those before I knew them very well. And I developed them very quickly. And then we say every house church pastor comes from an existing house church pastor. Mm-hmm. House church comes from within an existing house church. So, well, now we've seen a house church pastor before they become a house church pastor. We've gotten to know them in a house church, how humble they are, how doctrinally sound they are, how they care for other people, how people listen to them, how they step in and meet needs. And so, and once we've identified this is a probable potential house church pastor, then we get them into a training. We call it an incubator. And we just get them ready for this, acute ideas of doctrine, pastoral training, these kind of things. And then we multiply a house church with them. But of course, we have ongoing meetings with them and trainings for them. We say every pastor needs a pastor. So every house church pastor has a pastor who watches over them. They're discipled individually. And then their house church is overseen by somebody who oversees several house churches. So yeah, we care deeply about accountability. A lot of that has to do with onboarding, but it's ongoing accountability and training as well.
That's awesome. And how with that ongoing, how do you monitor the effectiveness, the health? Is there kind of like a report card kind of thing, or what is kind of that feedback loop to ensure that there's both being held accountable, they're encouraged, they're healthy, they're what are those kind of, I don't know if you call it safety factors in place to make sure that this stays in line?
Well, let's just say that every house church pastor has a coach who is coaching them. They're meeting with them individually once a month, and they're asking them questions about themselves, their walk with Jesus, their marriage, their health, their finances, all these things.
Yeah.
How's Jesus affecting every part of your life? Second, let's talk about the health of your house church. And we have some really good questions there. And that are people living life together beyond your weekly gatherings?
Yeah.
Are they having dinners, meals? Are they going on vacations together? How is your house church caring for one another? Like if somebody's sick, tell me some stories about what's happening. When somebody's in the hospital, when somebody needs somebody to watch their kids and they don't have anybody, tell me about benevolence that's happening in your house church. So really, life stories are the ways that our house church coaches can tell, is this house church healthy or not?
Yeah.
We say we like to look at things qualitatively rather than quantitatively. Like, what's the quality and health of this house church more than numbers? Although numbers factor in. They're referenced in the Bible. The Lord added to their number daily those who are being saved. So if a house church, for example, has too many people in it, but it won't multiply, then we have a qualitative question. The quantitative question, you have so many people. We have qualitative. Are you not raising up another house church pastor? Are you not willing to multiply people? Are you trying to build a super big house church? Because at some point it's going to atrophy and it'll be unhealthy.
Yeah.
So we have quantitative questions like, is it too big or is it too small? Are your people not bringing people into their house church community? Are people finally coming? Are they getting the courage to knock on a door they've never been at before? They walk in, but they don't feel cared for or welcome. Yeah. They're not going to come back. Do you have people who have been here, but they were out for a month because of travel or sickness or something, and nobody reached out to them, so they felt uncared for and didn't come back? So why is your house church not growing? Why is it shrinking? Why is it so big and won't multiply? So we have a lot of questions, but also we have this coach will go visit this house church on a rotating basis, see how it's going. We also monitor communications between house churches. We're on their social media feeds, their group meetings, and so all the leadership is on all these things. And so they see what's going on and they can tell how healthy it is or not. And so I have access to that, and I'll pop in a house church group feed every once in a while, just read it. And I can tell a lot about the health of that house church from reading things like that.
That's fantastic. Is there, Jason, a moment where you were implementing this? Because in many ways, other than the Bible and what you were seeing, there wasn't a tangible model. You were kind of then applying this to your new church that you were starting with Church Project. Was there a moment where like, this is working? Like that light bulb came on and you just saw maybe a story or a situation or a house church where it just clicked of like, yeah, this is, God affirmed this direction for Church Project?
That's hard for me because I'm always looking at what's not working well and how do we fix it? How do we help? And I think that's what Paul told Titus, right? The reason I left you and Titus, Paul, left you, Titus, and Crete, he said was to straighten out what's unfinished. Like, we got some things that you need to straighten out for me that I left for you.
Yeah.
So I feel like one of the roles that I have as one of the primary leaders here is to help straighten things out. But I do need to look more often and say, wow, that's really going great. There are some stories that do stick out in that. For example, I heard a story very early on when a couple in our church, both blue-collar workers, they didn't have great savings. Guy lost his job. They were about to go under in a week.
Yeah.
And he shared with his house church that night, I lost my job this week, and everybody prayed for him. The next week, the couple comes back, and the house church has money in a bag for them. We have checks for you. We're going to pay your mortgage for several months. But also we want you to meet with this guy who's a financial planner, and he's going to help you get your finances in order. And when you do get a job, help you build up some savings and things. And this guy's going to help you. He helps people find jobs. He's going to help you figure out your next career path. So this isn't going to happen. That guy got a new career soon. They got back on their feet. Their house church helped. It was so beautiful. Things like that happening. I remember one time very early on, we're sitting down to dinner as a family. My wife gets a message. Hey, so-and-so took their child to the hospital. And I'm like, hey, family, sorry, I got to go. And I get, because that's just the way you do it. I'm the pastor. Didn't have that many people. I'm going to go. And I get to the hospital. I go to the desk, I asked the receptionist, hi, I'm here to see so-and-so. They said, are you family? I said, no, I'm a pastor. And she said, their pastor's already here. I was like, that's odd. No, he's not.
Yeah.
Another church. I didn't know it. I went to the waiting room and all their house churches there. And the house church pastors already back, because these people are more connected to each other than I am to them. And their house church pastor was back there caring for them. And so those are little moments where I said, that's working.
Yeah, that's so affirming to what you want to see, and I think for pastors that are beginning to implement this, be looking for those moments, be looking for those affirmations, and practically, if you're not seeing them, maybe there's something that's not working that you need to be more alerted to. Jason, as we wrap up this conversation, what advice would you give to a pastor that maybe isn't a traditional small group model, and they're thinking, this sounds great, but I don't know how to turn the ship. We're already too far down this path. What recommendation would you give to how do you shift a church towards a church of house churches model?
Yeah, we get that question so much, and we are working with churches and helping them. And we're working actually on how we can help more people more.
Yeah.
Because this is a big deal. I mean, most pastors that I meet who are in a traditional model kind of church, they're asking this question because they hear something like this and like, I can't argue with it biblically and practically. I'd love to see that happening, but I can't just blow up my church. I don't want to leave and start something else. What do I do? And so we tell them, first, get a few people in leadership with you on the same page. Like your first small circle of leaders, often they'll read the little book I wrote, which is just a conversation starter about this. Or some other tool, whatever tool you have for that, get together and get on the same page about this, wrestle through this together, and then expand your circle. It may be your elders that read this book together and you talk about it and see why you would disagree with some of it. And then you take it to your next circle, maybe of all your small group leaders. And you're like, hey guys, why don't we just read this together and think and talk together? Don't scare them and tell them we're changing everything. Just start to have conversations. We have found that to be a really effective way of starting to make transitions. Like usually the lead pastor of a church will read this book, then he'll get his elders and then his leadership team to read it. Then there's small group leaders. And then they say, look, we believe we have some conviction and some clarity now, and we need to start moving forward. And these are the things that we're going to do. Don't be afraid. We're just going to take the small group leaders and we're going to help make you a pastor. And this gap that we've had between small group and the clergy, we're going to close that gap. We're going to help you learn how to do the occasional funeral or wedding. I mean, but wouldn't you as a small group leader want to do the wedding of somebody that you've been discipling in your group for a year, or maybe they met in your house?
Yeah.
Or if somebody dies that is in your house church, the spouse dies, wouldn't they rather you do the funeral than me, and they don't know me? And so we just start having don't you want to baptize somebody in a pool? How cool would that be? Don't you want to meet each other's needs because you're caring for each other so well, rather than send them to some office, fill out a form, and get in some benevolence budget? So when we really ask these basic questions about, don't you want to be a church? One of the distinctions of church that we didn't talk about a minute ago is diversity, but a church is diverse, but most small groups are diverse. But we ask small group leaders, hey, that are resistant to it or scared of it. Yeah. Hey, don't you want to have some diversity in your group? Like, don't you want rich and poor people, or young and old people, or married and unmarried, or mature and immature believer? Don't you want all these different beautiful textures of diversity that we find in the Bible? Do you want that represented among you? Or do you just want to be homogenous groupthink for the rest of your life? And so usually the answer that everybody answers to all these is, yes, I do want that. And so we're just helping them do that. So I say, start the conversation, become convinced and convicted yourself, get some clarity.
Yep.
Next circle, next circle, next circle. And then you'll make some steps on how to get there, usually through questions and conversations. And then, hey, this is how we're going to do it.
Yeah, I love that. And it is so practical. And I can't encourage people enough to get your book and we'll have links to that and everything on our website and on the podcast page. And so I want to encourage everyone listening to go to the Rethink and Return, or go to Rethink and Return podcast rediscovered.com. Make sure you get on our email list. And on that site, you're going to find a lot of different resources too that can help you navigate through this. And I want to be clear, this isn't a switch that you just flip. This is something that Jason, processed through years and has been fleshing out. And that's why I believe this podcast is so important, to have a conversation about those learnings so that you can share in those learnings and begin to figure out how you can integrate these principles and this theology into your church and into your body. And so we're so grateful for you listening, Jason. We're so grateful for your investment into sharing these insights. And we look forward to talking to you again on the next episode.
See you guys. Thanks, Nils.